Let's drink some bubble tea and have some double bubble gum. Toronto is the biggest real estate bubble in the world, according to UBS. I'm Michael Luzes. I'm a realtor in the Greater Toronto Area. Let's go through the UBS article that came out about a few weeks ago that talks about Toronto being the biggest real estate bubble in the world. Vancouver is right alongside with it. Before we get started, I'd love to hear your comments down below on if you think the bubble is already here. Has it already happened? As always, if you ever want to book in a call with me, click the link in the description down below. Book into my calendar anytime. So here we go. Drinking the housing bubble tea. This is a report from the Financial Post. Report labels Toronto, Vancouver markets as frothy, but it does contradict itself. UBS report rings alarm bells over housing bubbles, but predicts housing prices and sales will resume their upward trajectory. This is from October 17, 2022. So according to UBS Switzerland's AG's annual real estate bubble index, which tracks housing markets across 25 cities, they said Toronto's housing market is facing the highest bubble risk, while Vancouver is also considered to be bubbling. Indeed, Toronto is identified as the most prone to bubble risk, yet the report does not consider Toronto to be the most expensive of the 25 markets it covers. One of the report's affordability metrics is the number of years a skilled service worker would need to buy a 650 square foot condo near the city center. Toronto is in the bottom half of the list, suggesting a service worker would need to work for 7 years to be able to buy a modest-sized condominium. By comparison, they would need to work almost 25 years in Hong Kong and 15 years in Paris to afford an apartment. Now, you can go to UBS's website to get a more in-depth review on the Toronto housing bubble. Here's one thing that gets interesting. They have posted this more than once and many years over. So here's an article from April 5th, 2021. It's from CBC News. It's not just Toronto and Vancouver. Canada's housing bubble has gone national. As we take a look here, it says, when people picture red-hot real estate markets, they most likely think of soaring prices for the condos dotting Vancouver's skyline. They might also conjure up bidding wars for massive mega mansions in and around Toronto. It gets a little more interesting when we go back and see that Swiss bank UBS says Toronto has third biggest housing bubble in the world. Overvaluation deemed worse than Vancouver, New York, Hong Kong, and San Francisco. This article was posted on October 1st, 2020, almost exactly 2 years before the article of this year was posted. This article goes on to say a Swiss bank has concluded that Toronto's housing market is in bubble territory, as homes in the city are more of a price based on local rents and incomes than in places like New York, San Francisco, London, and Hong Kong. And as we just mentioned, UBS looks at 25 major cities in Europe, North America, the Middle East, and Asia. So I actually went back 10 years and just typed in Google Toronto housing bubble and basically took one article from each year. So let's go through a few of these and see what you guys think. Here's one from December 17, 2019. It says, assessing whether 2020 will bring a Canadian property tumble. This is from Don Pittis. He has done a few of these articles. A deep recession could pop bubble, but only a few think it'll occur this coming year. As we know what happened in 2020, no one could have predicted that, but here we are. In a world where interest on your savings account is in the 2% range and secure investments such as locked-in guaranteed investment certificates, also known as GICs, aren't paying a whole lot more, houses are once again feeling like the best place for ordinary Canadians to keep their money. Question being asked by many young Canadians who are considering buying their first home, and many boomers at the other end wondering when to sell, is whether those house price increases will continue in 2020, or will it all come crashing down? Most commentators from the real estate industry have been upbeat in their outlooks for the coming year. While not the 30% increments Vancouver saw at the peak of the boom, which was in 2017, new figures from the CREA, which is the Canadian Real Estate Association, out on Monday suggest that if you bought a house in November a year ago, that house was worth about 8.4% more in November this year. As a return on safe investments in the current market, that's astounding, and the tax advantage makes it even better. If you didn't know that in Canada, your primary residence is tax-free when you go to sell. So let's take a look here at another CBC News article, and I don't know if you guys have seen this before, but it says Toronto, Vancouver among biggest property bubbles in the world, UBS says. This was posted on September 18th, 2018 at 10:43 a.m. 9 years to buy a house in Vancouver, more than 6 in Toronto. As we saw in the article from this year, that's about 7 for Toronto now. Housing booms in Toronto and Vancouver have placed both cities on a UBS ranking of the world's biggest housing bubbles. Some cities were worse for renters and others presented particular challenges for foreigners. terms of overall housing prices being far more than they should be based on fundamentals, the bank singled out 6 cities for having the worst housing bubbles than anywhere else: Hong Kong, Munich, Toronto, Vancouver, London, Amsterdam. So let's just keep going here. And here we have May 16, 2017, the worst scenario. What if Canada's real estate bubble burst? A repeat of Toronto's 1989 crash could have devastating effects on the entire economy. It's a question lingering behind every headline, whispering among homeowners, would-be buyers and sellers, economists, and policymakers. What actually happens if Canadian real estate prices crash? On the one hand, a crash might be good for some Canadians already priced out of the market. And even a dramatic 40% drop in prices would set homeowners in markets like Toronto or Vancouver back, 2 or 3 years? House prices are notoriously off the charts. Everyone from the governor of the Bank of Canada to the chatty guy in your local cafe has said repeatedly that this increase in prices is not sustainable. But what that means, precisely vague. And remember, this was on May 16, 2017. 2017 had a big run up in pricing. So this is an article that came out as prices were on the upward trend and probably about to start their downward trend going into 2018. So here's one from March 16, 2016. Predictions of housing crash prove wrong for years, says BMO economist. The bubble will burst sometime, but the challenge for forecasters is getting the timing right. BMO chief economist Doug Porter calling out the bears who have predicted a housing market crash over the past 8 years. Canadian Real Estate Association noted that the average price of a Canadian home was now above $500,000. He pointed to forecasts as far back as 2008 that predicted a 25% crash in home prices. And he says, hey, forecasting is hard. Canada's non-Goldilocks housing market and the 33 bears. Here's an article from 2015, also by Don Pittis. It says, Canada's housing market faces a looming demographic bubble. Who will be able to afford the pricey homes currently owned by disappearing boomers? Yesterday, 2 more voices were added to the chorus warning about a crash in the Canadian property market. The Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives and the OECD, the rich country think tank, both worried publicly about the economic impact of a short-term downturn in housing prices. The fears of both groups are primarily based on the idea that higher interest rates will create a housing correction in an overheated market. Let's take a look here. 2014, Prime Minister Harper dismisses reports of Canadian housing bubble. Analyst is predicting crash that could cut home prices in half. Prime Minister Stephen Harper takes part in a question and answer session at Goldman Sachs in New York on Wednesday, says he's not afraid of a housing bubble in Canada. As we go down this article, this is my favorite line. Hilliard Macbeth says that condos are a terrible investment. They're not even an investment at all. Let's go back to December 12, 2013. Deutsche Bank says Canadian real estate is the most overvalued in the world. Prices as much as 60% too high. And again, this was December 12, 2013. Real estate prices in Canada most overvalued in the world, according to a new study from Deutsche Bank, which estimates home prices in the country are valued 60% too high. Some economists here have crunched their own numbers and come up with results similar to those of German Bank. It's true, housing does look very overvalued in Canada, particularly here in Toronto and in other major cities like Vancouver, for example. Anybody looking to buy a home should seriously be looking at the long-term view and not just base their decisions on the low interest rates. So we have a few more here, and here's one from Don Pittis. It's on April 16, 2012, and it says, be very afraid of the Canadian housing bubble. I want you to be afraid, very afraid of the Canadian housing market. I want people who are considering buying a house in Canada to be the most frightened. People who just bought a house also have every right to be nervous, but even if you don't have a stake in the property market, I would like you to be fearful of a bubble in Canadian property. I'm frightened myself. A lot of smart people are, but I should make it very clear I have no desire to be the Nouriel Roubini of the Canadian housing market. Roubini, for those who didn't notice, rose from B-Team academic to A-list fame and fortune by predicting the U.S. housing and market collapse of 2008. Right now in Canada, we are at the Chicken Little stage. Real estate industry and the banks say there is no bubble. Our finance minister, Jim Flaherty, has warned repeatedly about high debt levels, but even he is on record saying there is no bubble. I don't want you to listen to them, says Don. I want you to listen to The Economist, Canadian Business, The Wall Street Journal, each of which have sounded scary warnings. Maclean's magazine went a step further with a screaming headline saying it was time to panic. Here's one from June 29, 2011. Canada's housing bubble deemed close to bursting. And here's also one from February 10, 2010. Should Canada fear housing bubble trouble. These days, doesn't take much to steer a conversation towards the current state of the Canadian housing market. Put it mildly, it's been on fire. Average resale home in Canada sold for $337,000 in December, up 19% from a year earlier. Sales are up stunning 72%. Bidding wars in full swing in Toronto and Vancouver. Anecdotal reports of some properties drawing 20 offers or more. Housing would just become too unaffordable. So here's the last thing I'll finish with. This is the price points from those last, actually I went back to 2010, and you can see here where things have gone since then. One thing to note, this is for the Greater Toronto Area and just composite, so I just sandwich all the property types together in the entire Greater Toronto Area. Toronto as a whole has different numbers, and each individual property type would also have different numbers. However, the trend line is relatively similar between all of them. We can see here, on average, Toronto is very steady. It's gone up about 6.7% a year for the last 40 years. And one thing to note is all those articles were year after year after year of saying the same thing. Now you can see here in April 2017, we did have the peak of 2017, and things dropped pretty significantly and just kind of stagnated for a couple years. As we went through March 2022, we saw another big peak, and we're right back to where we should have been now in October 2022. So you can see here, just if we were to take a line and draw it straight across here, we'd basically be in line of where we should be or should have been the whole time. That's something to note as we take a look at all those articles, and I know there's a lot of them, but this chart kind of describes all of it, and it's interesting to see here how things like bubble talks have been going on for much longer than just this year. So you have it, 12 years of articles about the Toronto housing bubble, and this is something you can find very readily if you go on Google and just type in Toronto housing bubble and filter by each year. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on these articles. Are you surprised that you saw the same thing coming up kind of year over year or every couple years from UBS Bank, Deutsche Bank, and all different kind of economists and different articles? The one that really stood out to me was the one that says, be very afraid. That to me is just not something that you probably want to hear if you're a homeowner, and probably not something that you want to hear if you're looking to get into the market. I'm Michael Luzes. I'm a realtor in the Greater Toronto Area. If you found any value in this video, hit that like and subscribe button. I'm trying to get to 100 subscribers by the end of this year and keep bringing out more videos just like this to try to educate you on the Toronto real estate market. If you have any questions on what's exactly going on in the market in real time, I am on the ground level working with both buyers and sellers. You can book in a call with me in the calendar description down below. Happy to have a chat anytime.